Thank you, President Fenves. We'll get started with the program in just a moment, but I want to make several program announcements concerning today's symposium. First, most important, I need to recognize our co-hosts for this event, the Business Executives for National Security. The Bens have been great partners and have also done some exceptional research in this field that I'm hoping the Ben's CEO, General Nordy Shorts, will tell you a little bit about later today. Second, as President Fenves has before me, I need to thank and recognize the teams and the leaders at the Clements Center for National Security and the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. Without them, there would be no Intelligence Studies Project, and there would not be events like this one. Finally, I'll recognize our symposium co-sponsors at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. This is the welcoming academic home for the Intelligence Studies Project. So this is the third Intelligence Studies Symposium that we've convened in Austin. In the fall of 2014, the leaders of the American intelligence community, past and present, all traveled here on the 10th anniversary of the landmark Intelligence Reform Law to assess whether that legislation had in fact made us smarter, made us safer. Last spring, in the aftermath of Edward Snowden's unlawful disclosures, the President's Homeland Security Advisor, Tom Bossert's predecessor, members of Congress, leading civil liberties advocates, all came here to Austin to consider how effectively we were supervising and overseeing our exceptionally capable intelligence agencies. Today, our intelligence, law enforcement, and military communities deserve a great deal of credit for preventing, over more than a decade and a half, a second catastrophic attack on the American homeland. Our terrorist enemies are weakened, but they are not defeated. They have more recently adapted and now seek to direct or at least inspire adherents who are already present in the United States to commit violent acts. And what happened yesterday in London is a grim reminder of the seriousness of this threat, and I know all of our thoughts and prayers go out to our British allies, the victims of those attacks, and their families. So here's how we've organized today's symposium. First, we're going to consider the nature of the threat. Next, we're going to consider, with the help of FBI Director Comey, the intelligence and law enforcement response to that threat. Third, we're going to consider the role of the state and local governments, as well as the armed forces, in preventing these attacks. And then Mr. Bossert's going to share with us the new administration's domestic security policies. And finally, we're going to wrap up with maybe the most important session of the day, and that's where we consider how we keep ourselves safe while also preserving our cherished constitutional civil liberties. It promises to be a great day. So I'll issue a caution here up front that the introductions today will be uniformly short. Each of our symposium participants has an impressive resume, and there's a printed set of biographic profiles in the back if you want to learn more about our speakers. And so to moderate a discussion on the evolving domestic terror threat, I'll introduce Michele Malvesti, a professor of practice at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and a former senior director in the Combating Terrorism Directorate at the National Security Council staff. I'll add that I had the great pleasure of working closely with Michele on the NSC staff, and we were so pleased that we finally got her here to campus that we've asked her to speak again tomorrow at noon. So I'll encourage all of our students to join us at the Eastwoods room at the Texas Union at noon, where Michele is going to be speaking in connection with the Clements Center's Women in National Security Speaker Series. So for young ladies out there, part of our student body who are interested in having a career like Michele has, come join us tomorrow at noon at the Texas Union, and you can learn more from her. So with that, I'll invite Michele, Bruce, and Peter to the stage.
Sit in the middle. Great. Hi, everyone. As Steve said, I'm Michele Malvesti, and it's really a privilege to share the stage here with these two gentlemen who I've worked with off and on through the years. To my right is Professor Bruce Hoffman. When I started my career, probably about 25 years ago, looking at terrorism, there were very few scholars really researching and focusing on this issue. One of those handful of individuals was Bruce Hoffman. He's been researching this topic for 40 plus years. Now I say that he probably began researching at the age of 10. I don't want to date him. But he is a professor at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, where he also directs the Security Studies program, and it's great to be with you here today. To my left here is Peter Bergen. You may have seen him, of course, on CNN. He is a well-respected journalist. He is a published author, and he is also a vice president at the New America Foundation, where he directs the International Security and Fellows program. So it is a great pleasure to be working with you today. What I'd like to do is have each of these gentlemen just start off with maybe just about 2 minutes of opening remarks on how they view the current global terrorism landscape and its connectivity here to the threat we face directly inside the United States, inside the homeland. And then I think we'll go into a Q&A session. And with that, can I turn to you, Bruce, first?
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you to the organizers of the conference for inviting me. You know, we've seen the threat really encapsulated over the past 48 or 72 hours, because we've seen both of the extremes, warnings from the Department of Homeland Security and also from our British counterparts about a renewed threat to civil aviation that has resulted in a new set of restrictions from certain countries in terms of bringing on electronic goods. So that's the high-end threat, that after all these years, our adversaries still haven't given up their desire to target commercial aviation, and indeed now apparently have the technological ability or sophistication to pierce even a decade and a half worth of protective measures. But then, of course, yesterday with the tragedy in London, we saw the low-end threat, where an individual driving a vehicle armed with nothing more than a knife is able not just to tragically kill 4 people, injure 30 to 40 others, but of course make worldwide headlines. I mean, it's completely dominated the news cycle all day yesterday. And I think this is the enormous challenge that law enforcement in this country, and certainly our allies in Europe, but particularly here face, is that we have threats coming from multiple dimensions, the high end and the low end, from individuals in some cases, such as I would hazard a guess to say commercial aviation. That's a very directed, planned, premeditated, plotted terrorist operation, to lone wolves who much more spur of the moment, idiosyncratically undertake violence. And then I think law enforcement and intelligence is confronted in recent years by the third dimension, which is the enabled threat, where it's a lone wolf, but who's inspired, motivated, receives wink and a nudge to carry out an act of violence. And this, I think, is just unprecedented, having to deal with this multiplicity of levels and types of threats across the entire spectrum.
Great, thank you for that. I'm going to turn over here to Peter to build on these remarks and offer your own thoughts.
Yeah, well, building on what Bruce just said, so the enabled threat is in a way the biggest threat to the United States, because the last time, I mean, clearly we have to worry about foreign terrorist organizations in the United States trying to attack us. But the last time a foreign terrorist organization tried to attack us was in 2010, May 1st, when Faisal Shahzad tried to blow up a bomb in Times Square, and luckily it didn't work. He was trained by the Pakistani Taliban. But that's really the last example of somebody being trained overseas to do an attack in the United States. And you know, we've done a very good job since 9/11, zooming out a little bit. I mean, on 9/11 there were 16 people on the no-fly list. Now there are 81,000. On 9/11, the CIA and the FBI barely talked to each other. There was no National Counterterrorism Center. There was no DHS. There was no TSA. We've created this very, very strong defensive barrier. Now, it may not work all the time, but it's worked pretty well compared to the situation in Europe. And you know, the big difference between the United States and Europe is we're protected by geography. You can drive from Paris to Damascus. You can't drive from Austin to Damascus, obviously. And we're also protected by ideology. The American dream has worked very well for most American Muslims. They're, on average, as well educated as the average American. They're, on average, the same average incomes. They're well integrated into American society as a general proposition. Everything I've just said, you can just reverse in Europe. I mean, the telling point here in Europe is, you know, 8% of the French population is Muslim. 60% of that prison population is Muslim. So it's not a surprise that everybody involved in the Paris attacks and also the attacks in Brussels had all gone through the French or the Belgian prison system, which are really universities of jihad. So you know, we have a very different situation here. So accept the idea just generally that foreign terrorist organizations have a hard time operating here, which I think is factually true. So what then is the problem? The problem is basically people are already here. And these are largely American citizens that I created for a recent book I wrote about the question of what is the threat here. I looked at 400 cases since 9/11, and overwhelmingly, 80% of them jihadi terrorism cases were American citizens or legal permanent residents. Relatively few refugees, It's really an American phenomenon. Major Nadal's son, who after all killed 13 people not far from where we're sitting at Fort Hood, Texas, was born in Arlington, Virginia. Major Nadal's son, was an Army major. So getting back to what the kind of typology that Bruce mentioned, there's the enabled attack, which I think is very concerning because there are people here adopting these ideas. We saw in Garland, Texas, that when they tried to attack the Prophet Muhammad cartoon contest, they were in direct contact with people within ISIS who essentially directed them to do the attack. Luckily, it didn't work. So the enabled threat is really, I think, in terms of the threat environment, is the most serious here. You can't discount the other threats from outside. But what we really have since 9/11, every lethal terrorist attack since 9/11 in the United States has been conducted by an American citizen or American legal resident. They've had no formal connections to foreign terrorist organizations. And of course, threats can change, but that's the threat we've been dealing with for the last 15 years.
Thank you for that. I'd like to build specifically on your remarks, Peter, in particular given the tragic attacks in central London yesterday. Our European partners currently face a threat that is far more acute than the ones that we faced here. You just provided us some reasons on that. But can you envision a scenario in which the threat environment here in the United States approaches the one that is confronting Europe right now?
I can't, and I'll tell you why. So I mentioned geography insulates us from a lot of the kind of factors in the Middle East, and ideology. The American dream has worked very well for American Muslims. I'd add a sort of sub-part to that. If you look at the volume of American citizens who've tried to go to Syria or Iraq to join ISIS, the number is 250. That's not all of that's tried or succeeded. Relatively small number have succeeded. Many of them die. It's very dangerous over there. We've had 7 Americans come back from Syria. Interestingly, all of them associated almost with the Al-Qaeda affiliate rather than ISIS. None of them, only one of them tried to do some kind of attack. Compare that to Europe, where 1,500 French citizens have gone to fight, or 750 Belgians, a tiny country, or 750 Brits, or name your European country. You're seeing the volume is, there are about 7,000 Westerners, they're overwhelmingly Europeans who've gone to volunteer. So we just do not face, and as you know, Michele, well, the European security services are overwhelmed. They can't follow several hundred people who may not be a problem at any given time. The resources is very resource intensive. So, unless there was some very dramatic event, which I can't really imagine right now, I just don't see it approaching to what we have in France or in Belgium, or even places like Germany and Britain, where it's, we had Orlando, so that was that, and we also had San Bernardino, but that's a different kind of threat than something that's trained, organized, financed by ISIS itself.
Bruce, I'd like to turn to you. Is there, in your mind, do you envision the conditions under which the threat that we might face here approaches what we face in Europe?
Well, I think Peter's quite right that the numbers in the United States are completely eclipsed by those numbers of foreign fighters. More restive populations that have been very uneasily or perhaps not at all integrated into their national societies. But at the same time, I think that there's a lot of similarities and parallels. Up until 2014, all the threats came basically from Al-Qaeda. Now we have increasingly people motivated from ISIS, so that's a similar phenomena. We certainly don't have the hundreds of previous foreign fighters that reportedly have been inserted back into Europe. The New York Times reported on this extensively this summer. But at the same time, the numbers may be smaller, but terrorists always play a numbers game. I mean, from their perspective, it's the 1 or 2 that get it, not the hundreds necessarily. And I think what worries me, or what cautions against being completely complacent, is, firstly, tens of thousands of foreign fighters, maybe 8,000, 9,000 from Europe alone, went to the caliphate. They all had to surrender their passports. So there are circulating, I would imagine, clean passports that can be easily doctored and adopted from people not from countries that, let's say, in recent months have been designated, but from some of our allies that can provide the way for individuals to get into this country. Secondly, just the dimensions of radicalization and the demographics, to me, are alarming. Years ago, most of the people we had to worry about around the time of 9/11 were from the Arabian Peninsula, from the Middle East. We now have literally hundreds of Latin Americans, both converts and Muslims, who have been radicalized and have gone off to join either ISIS or Al-Qaeda. We have a radicalization phenomenon in the Caribbean, in Trinidad and Tobago. I would argue, too, that we have especially in Texas, the focus, of course, is on the southern border. But also, there's a northern border issue as well. Canada has 1/10 of the U.S. population, but nonetheless, twice as many foreign fighters from Canada have gone overseas. And Canada's different foreign policy than the United States, viewed as a more benign country, but nonetheless has a radicalization problem. Also, the authorities in Canada, whether it's their intelligence service or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, don't have the same authorities that we have in the United States to monitor and track people. So given that about 80% of Canada's population is within 10 miles of the United States, I mean, you can walk across the border in the north as well. So I think, yes, the threat is lower, but it's not zero, and that's the problem. And the terrorists, I think, play those odds, and it's the opportunity to have even an unsophisticated attack like yesterday in London nonetheless have worldwide repercussions.
Thank you for that. We've mentioned ISIS up here on the stage today, and ISIS clearly has dominated, in many ways, altered the global terrorism landscape over the past 3-4 years. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on in what ways has the emergence of ISIS specifically affected the threat we face here in the United States, inside the homeland?
We looked at 117 Syria-related cases, almost all of which are ISIS-related. And out of those 117 cases, 88 of the perpetrators had very, very strong use of social media, much more than just emailing people. They were posting jihadist material. So one way ISIS has changed things is that it is extraordinarily accessible. The FBI is looking at cases in 50 states. There is really no profile of somebody who might be tempted to, because we're seeing unprecedented numbers of females adopting the ideology. And so my concern is, ISIS is not the problem. ISIS is a symptom of some very deep problems, none of which are going to be solved necessarily in my professional lifetime. And so the question is, what does son of ISIS look like, and what does grandson of ISIS look like, and what are the things driving it? And the big things driving it are a sectarian civil war in the Middle East, where Sunnis feel kind of not represented both in Iraq and in Syria, the collapse of Arab governance, the collapse of Arab economies, the massive demographic explosion in the Muslim world, the massive wave of Muslim immigration into Europe, the alienations of Muslims in Europe, the rise of ultra-nationalist parties in Europe that kind of cause this the alienation problem to become deeper. And I don't see any of those big factors changing. And so, ISIS is about to lose Mosul, and maybe a year from now it will lose Raqqa. But what comes next? What does the day after look like? Go back to General Petraeus' famous question in 2003. Tell me how this ends. Well, we have no idea. We don't know 15 years later how this ends. Hopefully, and I think the Abadi government is a much better government than the Maliki government, and I think people, but it's hard to see how the Assad civil war is going to wind down anytime in the near future, except if Assad simply wins. So these big, ISIS is not the problem. Of course, it causes a lot of problems, but it is a symptom of deeper problems which are not necessarily being addressed by simply ending ISIS, which is a great goal, but the underlying political problems that caused it are continuing.
Bruce, I'd like to give you the opportunity to respond to that. And we can certainly progress through this throughout our conversation. But if ISIS is significantly, degraded, if not fully destroyed, what does come next? What does the next phase of violent Sunni, driven extremism look like?
Well, I mean, ISIS's fortunes are clearly falling, but I think at the same time, just as Peter described, it's here to stay in one form or the other, even if it devolves to just being a terrorist organization, or a terrorist organization capable of operating in Europe, but in other words, doing what terrorists always do, which is thrusting their cause on the world's agenda, destabilization, enormous disruption. I think the real problem is, regardless of ISIS's future fortunes, they've already changed the landscape, and this is unfortunate. What the FBI calls the flash to bang, in other words, the time between you actually plot, plan, and execute an operation, ISIS has just shrunk, which I think, once again, has put enormous pressure on the intelligence and law enforcement communities. Secondly, I think they've patented the use of very effective social media, but also communications technologies and methods that are off the shelf that frustrate even our most sophisticated abilities to intercept their communications. So this is something that we're going to see continue. Thirdly, they've completely muddied the waters. This is one of the problems in the United States, is you have individuals who claim allegiance to both ISIS and al-Qaeda, or say they're serving ISIS, but nonetheless are motivated by al-Qaeda. In some cases are motivated by a deceased propagandist and cleric like Anwar al-Awlaki. So it's the third impact. The fourth, I would argue, and this gets into your question about the future, is I think from al-Qaeda's perspective, ISIS has sucked all the oxygen out of the room, consumed all of our attention, but in that process has further enervated us in what is now a decade-and-a-half war on terrorism. It's done what terrorists have sought to do over history: undermine confidence in elected leadership, create profound divisions in societies. And in this sense, I think al-Qaeda, just as Peter says, we don't know what the next step is, but I would imagine one of them is al-Qaeda waiting in the wings while we continue to engage with ISIS. And then at a time that we think that we've triumphed or at least reversed this immediate terrorist threat, to reemerge and resurface in a punishing fashion.
So you, I want to turn to Peter in a moment to continue on Iraq and his recent trip in ISIS. But in mentioning al-Qaeda, you recently had articulated in your testimony in front of the HASC, that they are effectively, I don't know if they're biding time, but they are certainly, to use your words, rebuilding, marshaling their resources, particularly while so much of the media attention is on ISIS. And overall, how do you see the long-term threat evolving from al-Qaeda here for the homeland?
Well, I think actually al-Qaeda is poised eventually to absorb the rump of ISIS. I don't think the ideologies are all that different. I think a lot of the division over the past 3 years has been predicated on leadership rivalries and a very idiosyncratic, deeply personal enmity between Baghdadi and al-Zawahiri. So I think that you could have, and I think on all levels, in terms of leadership, cohesion, membership, long-term plan, al-Qaeda completely trumps ISIS. The one advantage ISIS has right now is this international or external operations capability. And I think that's what ISIS covets. So any kind of reamalgamation or any kind of merger, I think, would take the current threat and elevate it to a completely different level. And that's, I think, one concern. The second concern I have is that the longer this war goes on, or the longer the struggle against terrorism, if it does transition into this new phase, I mean, I think we're seeing it in our country now and also with our European allies, is we just have limited energy, limited resources. We have an exhausted public. They feel that through that strategy of attrition, eventually they will triumph. So I think from al-Qaeda's perspective, that alone is an enormous appeal to carry on the struggle, believing, like all terrorists throughout history have, they know they can't defeat their state enemies militarily, but they eventually believe that will just become demoralized.
Thanks. Peter, would you like to add your thoughts on al-Qaeda, and then I want to come back to Iraq here in a moment.
Well, I totally agree with Bruce that a ISIS-Al-Qaeda merger is just as likely as the ISIS-Al-Qaeda split, which is really Freud has a very useful term which explains a lot of human activity, which is the narcissism of minor differences. And in this case, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, I mean, if you look at ISIS propaganda, bin Laden is a very big deal for them. They see themselves as inheriting the mantle of bin Laden, and sort of Ayman al-Zawahiri, they don't, it's just a sort of jumped up guy. So I could easily see them merging 3 or 4 years down the road with a rump ISIS, as Bruce says. But I think one thing we have to be careful about is imputing to our enemies strategic goals that are more coherent than, we shouldn't make the mistake that these guys have a grand plan that really makes sense. So for instance, on 9/11, the idea was to attack us and we pull out of the Middle East. Well, that didn't work. I mean, we were more involved in the Middle East in our history. I mean, bin Laden, later Al-Qaeda said this was all a clever plan to sort of bleed us dry. And believe me, this is not what they thought. I mean, bin Laden, I met him in '97. He laid out the plan, and he said it many, many times before 9/11. America is a paper tiger. Think of Vietnam, Somalia, Mogadishu, Beirut in 1983. Just apply enough pressure, they'll pull out. Well, that completely failed. Similarly, ISIS had a huge strategic misstep, which is when they had the caliphate, they had a great thing going. But then they started attacking in the West. Well, the reason the caliphate is about to disappear is because of these attacks in the West. When they attacked in Istanbul, the Turkish army invaded Syria. Now, the Turkish army is not some ragtag militia. It's close air support and tanks, and they just, they made great progress. So I think we need to be careful not to make the mistake that our enemies necessarily have, these grand strategic visions that make a lot of sense. I think that they have very incoherent ideas. They're on the wrong side of history. Yes, I mean, the idea that somehow they're going to bankrupt us, which was another thing that, on 9/11, the United States lost 4% of its GDP, $500 billion. But at that time, we were a $14 trillion economy. So they have very naive views about us, and I think we have to be careful not to sort of fall into the trap of agreeing with their own ideas about us when essentially they're wrong.
You recently returned from Iraq.
Yeah.
I'd love for you to offer any thoughts that you have on this. I do want to ask a specific question, and then you can build upon that. So much of the focus in the media today when we speak about ISIS really focuses on the conventional fight that is ongoing in Iraq, in Syria, the effort to stem and to roll back the territorial gains of the physical caliphate and the sanctuary that provides to the group's senior leaders. What is the connective tissue, or can you kind of elaborate for us the connective tissue between the conventional fight ongoing on the ground and the threat environment that we face here in the United States?
Well, unfortunately, I think they're losing, but we're also seeing that whether it's inspired, enabled, or directed, as they've been losing, they've been imposing costs on the West. But I think if you look at the Mosul operation, this is I think it's gone remarkably well because the politics were worked out ahead of time. Brett McGurk and others, spent a long time making sure it was the Iraqi military that went into Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, not the Shia militias, not the Kurdish the Kurdish militias. So this is very, very important. But we still don't quite know what the day after is going to look like. But if the day after looks anything like the run-up, then we're in okay shape. And I think the Iraqi government, I was in Kurdistan, it's the first, I've been in Iraq before, I'd never been in Kurdistan. And I think it would be a great place for President Trump to visit because this is a secular society. Women dressed like anybody in this room, sometimes with headscarves. It's a free market economy. It's a very open society. I went to a conference where the students, very similar to this conference, the students took to task the 3-star Iraqi general leading the Mosul operation and asked him some very pointed questions. And it's a success story in the Middle East where there aren't a lot of success stories. And it's a success story. The Kurds are very pro-American. So I came away, I'd heard all this about Kurdistan, but I'd never sort of seen it with my own eyes. And I strangely felt more optimistic about Iraq than I have felt about Afghanistan. And normally it's the other way around. But there are some good things going on. The price of oil doesn't help them with the fact that it's going down. But there does seem to be an understanding amongst all the players that we can't go back to 2006.
Thank you for that. Bruce, are there anything you'd like to add?
I think the connectivity is fear. That I think the country now reacts very differently to the terrorist threat in 2017 than it did, for instance, in 2010 or 2011. And ISIS plays a huge role in that. And of course, the fear is completely irrational, but nonetheless, this is the terrorist stock and trade. It's playing on the anxiety of forcing publics to press their leaders to move liberal societies to more illiberal security needs, which plays into the terrorist narratives. So I agree with Peter. I don't think that they have this world plan that's a clear strategy, but nonetheless, I think they have an abiding faith that if they keep on struggling, this is what sustains their movement, unfortunately, and causes lots of problems for us, and fear being one of them. And unfortunately, their narrative that they have thus far, for a decade and a half, survived the greatest onslaught in history ever directed against the terrorist movement by the technologically most advanced military. This feeds into their ability to recruit people. And that's, I think, why ISIS has been so corrosive, because they actually seized territory and established their phony proto-state. But that was an enormous draw and an enormous pull. And I would say one of the problems I think we face right now is that just in the past 3 or 4 years, the number of terrorist sanctuaries and safe havens has increased rather than contracted. Even in ISIS's case, an NCTC study, a National Counterterrorism Center study from this past summer, reported that when we started the campaign against ISIS, they had a presence, or branches, or vilayets as they call them, in 7 countries. 2015, it had nearly doubled. By August, it was up to 18. So yes, we're hammering them and defeating them in Iraq, but they're already adjusting and adapting to that strategy to ensure their longevity, not necessarily that they're going to defeat us, but that they continue to be a factor in our politics and in our security concerns.
Let's focus a little bit on the tools that we're currently using. You mentioned part of our strategies. Are we using the right tools? Do we actually have the right mix of tools particularly focused on preventing attacks here in the United States. Are we over-investing in some areas? Are we perhaps under-investing in other areas?
Yogi Berra famously said it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future, and that's the problem, which is something's going to happen. History is going to happen to us, and we're going to be surprised. And what form will that take is the interesting question. And yes, black swans are hard to predict, but let's maybe look at some gray swans. So I think a gray swan that I think is a reasonable one to be concerned about is the kind of Moore's law in bioterrorism. I mean, go back to shortly after 9/11, Bruce Ivins killed 5 people with the anthrax attacks. He caused about $1 billion of damage to the American economy. He was one of the most sophisticated microbiologists in the world. Now, 15 years later, I know nothing about this subject, but my understanding is that, you know, a high school student can do things that would have been pretty complicated, 2 decades ago. And so if you accept the idea there's a sort of Moore's law in biology and biological terrorism by extension, and by the way, the motives of somebody conducting a biological terrorist attack in the United States don't have to be jihadist. Bruce Ivins' motives were idiosyncratic beyond belief. It wasn't really clear he had an obsession about a particular girls' school. He was a very strange guy. And so the real thing we need to be concerned about is not terrorists developing biological weapons, I think. It is biologists adopting jihadist ideas somewhere, in Indonesia, or pick your country, who has some real skills, and then, unleashing that. And I think, we've invested a lot of money to make sure that we have the right response. But that's the kind of thing that's plausible to me that would kind of change the game. And there are a couple of other things that can also change the game. I think armed drones is a very, this used to be the monopoly of states. Now we have Hezbollah using an armed drone against an al-Qaeda camp in 2014 in Syria. We've had the Houthis using armed drones in Yemen. They're now using submersible drones. So think about the USS Cole attack, which after all happened in Yemen, but this time with a submersible drone. So these are the kinds of things, the technological kind of changes that might, and I even, Bruce referred to this earlier, but I mean, clearly the insider threat at airports, this is the holy grail for these people. And if they can bring down an airliner somewhere from anywhere in the world that's kind of on a flight to the United States, that's, I think if President Obama, if that Northwest Flight 253 had blown up over Detroit on Christmas Day 2009, President Obama would have been a one-term president. That's not a kind of political observation. That's just an observation about where we are. And so that, again, could be a game changer. So, I have a naturally sort of more optimistic view sometimes than Bruce. We debated this for decades. But there are these kinds of biological terrorism, the insider threat, armed drones. Our embassies are very well defended against truck bombs. Going back to the question, the Inman standards that came in after '98, are they really well defended against armed drones? I don't know. But that's somewhere I would be looking to make as many measures as possible.
So, Bruce, I'd like to give you the opportunity to answer that, but especially since Peter raised the issue of CBRNE, I know this is something on WMD that you also addressed in your recent testimony. Is there something that you can share here with us to highlight the current threat in that arena?
Well, I think, in the 13 years or so since the invasion of Iraq, any discussion of terrorism in WMD has largely fallen off the table, and I think that we neglect it at our peril because I think our enemies are always seeking new means to pierce our defenses, and our defenses, as Peter has described, have been superb, but this is what terrorism is about, is staying one step or even a half a step ahead of that counterterrorism technology curve. My fear is that this proliferation of sanctuary and safe haven, just like before 9/11, gives al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, as we know, had very ambitious programs in chemical, biological, radiological, and even nuclear weapons. Now, nuclear weapons wasn't even in the quarter-baked, much less half-baked realm. But nonetheless, they were thinking very seriously about it. I think in this day and age, a decade and a half later, we shouldn't delude ourselves that they're still not thinking along those lines, that to them wouldn't be the game changer that they believe if they could embrace. I'm not necessarily nuclear, but any unconventional attack. I mean, we see the repercussions and the impact that an attack with a vehicle and a knife has. Imagine an attack that even might have a discrete number of casualties that involved anthrax or another sarin nerve gas attack, such as the Tokyo subway. And there has been evidence in recent years of both al-Qaeda or Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS attempting to develop chemical and in some instances biological weapons. Also, too, some of the countries that might be the sources of these types of technologies, North Korea, for example, allies like Pakistan, potentially, from their stockpiles. I mean, it's not that this is an hermetically sealed environment. I would argue it's, in fact, less so today than it was at the time of A.Q. Khan, that might be appealing to terrorists?
Thank you for that. I'd like to give you the opportunity to respond to the initial query on, are we over-investing or under-investing? Do we actually have the right mix of tools here to counter the terrorist threat here in the United States?
No, I think we do, and I think that the proof is in the pudding, the successes that law enforcement and intelligence have had. However, I mean, this is an evolutionary phenomena, and what worries me is a lot of the success, let's say, of the FBI against domestic adversaries in the past decade. I mean, I know this from my work on the 9/11 Review Commission, was through their ability, CALEA, FISAs, in other words, their ability to intercept communications, to gain access to the terrorist technologies that they used to communicate with. Obviously, in the post-Snowden world, with the exposures just recently, the tools that intelligence and law enforcement use against terrorists is now much more broadly and widely known. And that means that terrorists adapt and adjust to them. Even if there are fixes over time, that interregnum makes things very dangerous. Also, in the United States, in the past few years, there have been more intensified debates over surveillance and over the authorities and powers of the federal government. Yet these are the things that have kept us safe. Secondly, I think it's just this proliferation of threats on multiple levels and asking law enforcement and intelligence at a time, unlike a decade ago, of declining resources, not expanding resources, declining workforces. So sequestration was an enormous blow, especially to the FBI, for example. I mean, think of it this way. Cyber security issues have been in the news prominently now for several months. 1/15 of the entirety of the FBI is devoted to cyber. 1/35 of all special agents are cyber trained. Yet we're also looking to the FBI to defend us against terrorism, and a terrorist threat, as we've discussed, that is becoming more complex, more diffuse, more difficult to track and anticipate. So I think the tools are fine, but this is an evolutionary threat that's demanding and expecting more of those who are charged with protecting us and keeping us safe.
Great, thank you. In a moment, I want to open it up to the audience. I always feel like Q&As are always the most productive part of any type of discussion and conference like this. But I would like to ask just one final question of our panelists. And how does this all end? Does it? Is there a self-sustaining quality to the current terrorist or current extremist narrative, or will it be bypassed by history? Is this an enduring threat that we will have an enduring responsibility for the next 50 years? Are we destined to be coping with this, in some form or fashion? And I'd like to hear from both of you on this.
Well, I think we're destined to be perennially distracted by it. And that's, I mean, terrorism, I would not, even though I've spent my career studying terrorism, I wouldn't elevate that to the single most threatening challenge to United States security. But we pay a price for that distraction. And it consumes attention, it consumes the activities, especially of our intelligence community. And unfortunately, given, I think, just the evolution of terrorists, where they've been able to, ISIS in particular, use social media so effectively, we have to be prepared for the next big thing that's going to enable them at least to sustain their campaign at this non-existential level. Of course, it's not existential, but one that nonetheless comes with an enormous cost. I mean, enormous cost in resources, the expansion of U.S. security establishment that Peter described at the beginning to keep us safe is one example, but also the attention of the public and the attention of our politicians. There's always a price to pay because of terrorism being this elephant in the room that we have to contend with and prepare against, even though it may be infrequent, even though in many cases it's not consequential in terms of actually affecting the security of the United States in any existential form, but nonetheless has a profound impact on our politics and on our sense of safety.
Thank you for that, Bruce. Peter.
Since we're in an academic environment, I'm going to make an academic observation. So David Rappaport famously pointed out there were 4 waves of terrorism. The anarchist wave, they killed President McKinley. Then there was the kind of nationalist wave, the sort of IRA, and also then the kind of socialist wave, the sort of Baader Meinhof, and now the jihadi wave. And following Rappaport's typology, we should be at the end of the wave because this wave began in '79. But I think the difference is if you claim God is on your side, that's a very thing hard to abolish. You can abolish the Soviet Union. There weren't many takers for socialist revolution once the Soviet Union disappeared. I think with the claim that God is actually on your side, I think this is something that's going to have much longer legs than the other waves of terrorism that we've seen throughout the 20th and 21st century.
Thank you. With that, I hope that this has given us a lot of information to digest, and hopefully it'll be a great springboard for your questions. And unless Steve or somebody would like to moderate, I'm happy to field questions. And if I could just ask that when you ask your question, just if you could identify yourself and then speak up till we can make sure that we hear this appropriately. And there is microphones that we can handle. And sir, you had your hand up.
Yes, Peter, you mentioned that the radicalization.
Here, we got the mic coming.
Peter, you mentioned the radicalization process in Europe is much more clear-cut with the prison system. And you also mentioned that in America, most of the terrorists were domestic, either U.S. citizens or LPRs. Is there a key demographic that's really been identified as who is going to become a terrorist? And with the internet and the radicalization process being as fast as it is, are there methods that the IC and law enforcement can interdict it before it happens?
Yeah, until we have a machine that can read men's souls or women's souls, we're not going to have a good answer to that. Because, Bruce mentioned the flash to bang, how quick it is now. And of course, we have the First Amendment in this country. And so, we're protected in lots of ways about looking into these ideologies. So I don't think there is a very good answer to that. I think there is just an imperfect answer of law enforcement doing what it can, sometimes getting it right and sometimes getting it slightly wrong. I think certainly the FBI is occasionally engaged in somewhat overzealous prosecutions, but on the other hand, if I was in their position, I'd probably do the same thing because they get blamed if a bomb goes off or something happens. So I don't think there is a very good answer to that question. There may be a big data may present an answer to that question. I think it'll be very hard to implement in this country for all sorts of legal reasons. But if you know enough about what people are looking for, and I think certainly the GEC at the State Department is doing a good job of targeting, presenting other ideas to people who might be looking at ISIS propaganda online. I know that Google's doing some of this as well. So people are thinking about it. But at the end of the day, the decision to kill complete strangers is a very individual one, and it's not easy to kind of reach, kind of get in at the point where you really. But one thing that is very important, the FBI has looked at a number of cases since 2009 in this country, and they found that the people who know the most information, this is not surprising, are peers and family members, and the people who know the least information are strangers. And people who know slightly more information are authority figures, clerics, bosses. So the people who know the least useful amount of information are strangers, and they're the most likely to put up their hand to say something's going on. But there's a lot of false positives as a result. And I was fascinated by the Dylan Roof case. So Dylan Roof told a friend of his who was planning to attack that church and kill people that he had a gun, and his friend didn't say anything. In fact, his friend was so concerned that this was a real threat that he took the gun away from him briefly. So whether it's a jihadi terrorism case or a school shooting or a neo-Nazi, the people who know the most are peers and family members. So the answer to your question, sir, I think, is trying to enlist those people to the extent that you can.
Thank you for this. Do we have another question from the audience? The gentleman in the back, you have your hand raised. And again, if you could just identify yourself and wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Oh, hello, my name is Adam Vojtovic, and I have a question for you. What is the ideal aftermath when the threat is vanquished in the Middle East or any crucial countries with bad government? What is the ideal aftermath after the terrorism is defeated?
Thank you for that. Bruce?
Well, that's a very good question. I think terrorism has existed for 2,000 years. It's not going away anytime soon. But I think victory, at least to me, or success against terrorism, is really when it's reduced from its strategic consequences, the ability to reorient national borders, to overthrow governments, to instill widespread fear in populations that affect political decision-making and resource allocation, and goes back to what terrorism was for most of its existence, which was something that elbowed its way into the limelight, that got attention, that tragically killed people, but did not have strategic and certainly not existential consequences. I think some of this discussion has shown that the threat is constantly changing, and in some cases, when we look to the future, could be poised to go in a different direction, which means we can never be complacent. But at the same time, though, we have to realize that terrorism only succeeds by our reaction to it. And that's why I think you have to avoid the trap that terrorists always set. Terrorists are always trying to provoke some response that they believe will benefit them, that will feed into their narrative and undermine the credibility of their adversaries. So reacting soberly and reasonably and having reasonable expectations of what success looks like is enormously important.
And not being overprovoked,
Precisely.
into response. So like them. Peter, is there anything you'd like to add to that? I think if we're looking at compressing, the scope and scale of the problem so that can be managed down at a local level, what might, to use the questioner's words, that ideal aftermath look like?
I'm just going to agree with Bruce. I mean, when we're not having these conferences, when it's not, I thought with the death of bin Laden, the Arab Spring, that terrorism would go back into sort of a second order problem. Terrorism's been around forever, but not the major national security problem that we orient all our national security around. And of course, I was completely wrong. And the Arab Spring turned into the Arab Winter and produced all the vacuums that we know and the results that we know. One thing I think from a political point of view, it's very hard to say the following thing. We have managed and contained the problem. And I think in the United States, we basically have. The political costs of saying that and then having anything happen are so large that no one's going to say it. But the fact is that we have done a very good job. Everybody in this room, in one way or another, has contributed to making this a lot safer. If I'd said to you, if we'd had this discussion in 2002 and I made the following prediction, in the next decade and a half, on average, 6 Americans a year will be killed by jihadi terrorists, you would have said, that's an absurdly optimistic prediction. Because we were thinking about another large-scale attack for years after 9/11. And yet, that is where we are. Unfortunately, 94 Americans have been killed by jihadi terrorists since 9/11. And each of these are individual tragedies. But they're not national catastrophes like 9/11 was. Or even Paris, where 130 people were killed in 24 hours.
Thank you. Another question for the audience here. I'm sorry, was that gentleman has the hand up? Yes.
I wanted to ask what the real impact of terrorism is in the human losses and how many attacks have been prevented by intelligence service in the United States since 9/11.
Thank you. Peter?
Do you know
Bruce?
from your book?
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
Figure might be?
There are various levels of answer to that, because a lot of what the FBI does is sting operations where it's not really clear that there was necessarily a really serious attack. But there have been some very serious near misses, and I would say the underwear bomber who almost brought down Northwest Flight 253, if that plane had gone up and covered live on CNN and every other news network, we'd be having a very different discussion today. Najib al-Azazi, trained by al-Qaeda, tried to blow up with 2 other American citizens bombs in the Manhattan subway. But it was only because of British intelligence tipping us off at the last moment that was averted. So there have been a number of relatively serious plots. Those are the 2, I think, and I also mentioned Faisal al-Assad, trained by the Pakistani Taliban. These are probably the 3. They all came actually interestingly in the Obama administration, which is just, I'm not really making any kind of point about that. It's interesting. If you think about the way that President Obama came into office, he was the president who was going to end wars. He could see that his presidency was almost over on Christmas Day 2009. The number of meetings about terrorism in the Situation Room went from 25% to suddenly 50% plus. So, he didn't expect to be the drone president but events intervene. So, we've had some serious near misses. There's no doubt about it.
Thank you.
Well, and even before, I mean, when you were on the NSC, Jose Padilla,
Yes.
Ayman Farris, I mean, there was a spate of them as well that we have been enormously successful. The problem is, though, generally we only remember the Omar Mateens, really, or Farouk Saeed and the failures. And that's, again, it's not, I don't think it's a question of numbers, it's a question of perception. And that's unfortunately where terrorists draw all their power. It's by manipulating that perception, just as Peter said earlier, making them seem more monolithic, more omnipotent than they are. I mean, this is exactly what they use as their recruitment tools and what becomes so successful in sustaining their own narratives and their own ability to survive even the tremendous setbacks that we've dealt to these organizations.
Can I suggest one kind of policy idea, which may not be completely popular, but you know, to me it is absolutely crazy that somebody on a no-fly list can buy semi-automatic weapons. And in the wake of Orlando, there was, Peter King has had, who's a Republican from New York, has had legislation for 10 years now, saying that if you're subject of serious FBI inquiry in terrorism, you shouldn't be allowed to buy semi-automatic weapons. Now, Omar Mateen, who Bruce just mentioned, killed 49 people. He legally purchased 4 semi-automatic weapons, despite the fact that he'd been the subject of 2 FBI interrogations. Carlos Bledsoe killed an American soldier in Little Rock, Arkansas, similarly bought a semi-automatic weapon in 2009, killed an American soldier. Major Nidal Hassan bought 4 semi-automatic weapons. Now, he's an Army major. He can't go out on the street and buy sort of a gun from a criminal. He wouldn't know how to do it. So if we were looking at common sense measures that actually would reduce the lethality of terrorists, this would be one of them. And the NRA has produced a kind of smokescreen around this. There are 81,000 people on the no-fly list. Only 800 of them are Americans. And I think pretty much, I'm pretty sure pretty much all of those 800 Americans should be on that no-fly list. So if you're an American citizen, the subject of an FBI inquiry, it seems to me a common sense measure, which will never happen, is that you should not be able to purchase semi-automatic weapons.
Thank you. Perhaps this is something we could certainly raise with Dr. Comey. You have your, oh, I'm sorry, was there a gentleman over here? Please, first, I want to make sure that, yes, please.
Thank you, Scott Stevens. Bruce, you mentioned earlier that terrorism is a significant distraction to the U.S. risk, but maybe not the greatest risk. If we're to presume that maybe the greatest risks are coming from other countries, say in Europe or in Asia, to what extent does terrorism affect those countries' efforts and their interactions with the U.S.?
Thank you.
Well, and also, too, I want to qualify by a distraction. I don't want to say that it's inconsequential. It's just it's not an existential threat, I think would be a better word than a distraction. My point was that our focus on terrorism comes at a cost for other things. And I think, as we've seen in recent years, terrorism has sometimes strengthened our alliances with other countries, but also created profound differences, and profound differences that sometimes have hurt our diplomatic relations, that sometimes have turned countries that we've considered to be very close allies into, quote-unquote, frenemies. So in that sense, I think terrorism does have this overall pernicious effect on international stability and order, certainly even on our diplomatic relations as well. And also, too, it can poison international organizations as well by diverting discussions from real issues to more peripheral ones.
Thank you. Gentlemen, you had your hand up right here, please. Thank you, sir.
Hi, Shane Walsh. Bruce, you mentioned the idea that the FBI is less able to monitor or has less success monitoring potential communications back and forth. And given the sort of climate now where particularly technology companies are sort of wrapping themselves in the First Amendment in some cases, or at the very least saying they're looking out legitimately for their clients' privacy. And then with the Snowden/WikiLeaks folks nowadays that there are certainly certain segments of the population that feel like that those people are heroes to some extent. And I think that's obviously very different than it was 15 years ago. And so I guess this is an opinion question. How much more difficult or how is their job, or how much more likely is it making it that we experience some sort of major national catastrophe based on the law enforcement's inability to monitor communications, not to protect the state, but protect the individuals?
Well, I mean, certainly it's a problem that's not just specific to American law enforcement, but to the American intelligence community. And certainly the revelations over the years of how we gather information and what techniques have used have resulted in terrorists adapting and adjusting and using different means, and also taking advantage of commercially available apps like, Telegram, WhatsApp, that are encrypted to communicate with one another. I mean, I think, what encapsulates the challenge was Saeed Farouk's iPhone, and whether Apple would give the FBI access to it. Now, in the end, the FBI was able to develop a workaround to gain that information. Now, these are the types of debates I think that any democratic liberal society has to have, because you're always going to have to strike a balance between giving the authorities the tools that they need to keep us safe, but at the same time protecting the rights of individual citizens and our fundamental civil liberties. I think that's perennial. What changes constantly is our perception of the threat and how much authority we want to devolve to law enforcement and intelligence. And at times, especially when the threat seems to be lower, we seem more comfortable with clawing back some of those responsibilities. But I think it's a balance that has to be constantly calibrated.
Thank you. Let's go to the woman here with her hand up.
Hi, Brenna Larkin. Going back to what you both touched on earlier with reducing the strategic benefits of terrorism, recent national security strategies and speeches have sort of put terrorism second and played up other issues. Is this the right path? And what role can publicity and media play in reducing these strategic benefits?
Peter, would you like to?
Well, you know, Maggie Thatcher famously said that the oxygen of terrorism is publicity, and she said that in 1985, and that's simply a fact. But what's interesting, and of course, you know, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, I mean, do the thought experiment where we didn't cover London yesterday. I mean, it's an absurd thought experiment. This is a huge news story. I think the media has got much savvier about not naming the perpetrators of these attacks and not, you know, Time magazine had the Major Nidar Hassan on the cover. I think that kind of thing we're seeing less of. You know, Anderson Cooper makes a point of not talking about the perpetrators, and we're seeing an effort to focus on the victims. And so, you know, I mean, we're trying to do our best, and we're citizens just like everybody else. And this whole debate, interestingly, is basically now dead because, you know, the guy who killed the cop in Paris broadcasted on Facebook Live a year ago. The people who killed those 20 people in the Dhaka restaurant posted in real time the attack, and it was shown on Amaq, which is ISIS's news agency. So it used to be that media, terrorism wanted to use the media. Now the terrorists and media have merged together. And so we'll see in this country, you know, the next terrorist attack in this country will almost certainly be covered live by the perpetrator himself, which will cause some very interesting questions about how do you handle that as a society. So I think that, you know, that discussion has moved on because the technology's moved on.
Bruce, I think in one of your books, Inside Terrorism, you cover the role of the old media, new media, et cetera. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, and Peter's exactly right. I mean, there was an old media, there was the new media, which was the internet. Now, as he describes, well, it's ISIS's bumper sticker. Don't hear about us, hear from us. Is that they can completely bypass the traditional media. So I don't think the media is a problem. I think where the heart of the question is really, I think wherever terrorism is ranked as a threat or isn't ranked, all citizens of all countries have one fundamental expectation of their government, and that's to protect and defend them and keep them safe. And that's why terrorism becomes this enormous challenge, and why governments are forced to devote resources, to devote attention to terrorism, and why I think over time it's the terrorist belief that they can have this corrosive effect on our societies, this erosion of core values, for example, of fundamental civil liberties, and it's this generation of fear that they use their own media really right now, I think, to completely bypass and, in fact, even emphasize what might be avoided by our mainstream press.
Thank you. The gentleman right here had your hand up. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Brooks Troiani, and I'm from the LBJ School. My question is, if you could talk a little bit more about state-sponsored terrorism and the future and the potential use of terrorism as a tool for great powers to use to destabilize their rivals, or, you know, the use of paramilitaries and their use of terrorism.
Well, certainly, you know, throughout history, states have used terrorists. I mean, the origins of the First World War, really. I mean, the gun that Gavril Princip fired that killed the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was supplied to him by the Serbian General Staff. It's nothing new. I think it's become more common because it's a clandestine, surreptitious, essentially cost-free way of waging war against more powerful and more sophisticated adversaries. And the problem was about 20 years ago, that would have been one of the main ways of doing it. Now I'd say cyber attacks are yet another way that's clandestine, that's surreptitious, that can do enormous damage to one's opponents. And you can see the attraction of using all these different tools because of the cost to our societies and because of the difficulties of defending against them, because of the added pressure. I mean, we've been talking about lone wolves and enabled terrorism. I mean, you've raised yet another category that's enormously important and, of course, consumes the time of our intelligence and law enforcement officials, and that's state-sponsored terrorists, or terrorists that are operating in the pay or have somehow been, even clandestine intelligence services engaging in terrorist types of operations, or other security challenges that have just multiplied in recent years.
Thank you. Peter? No. We have a question over here. Yes, ma'am, please.
Hi, yeah, I'm Ann Kilroy. I'm a student at LBJ School as well. We spent a lot of time this morning talking about the physical threats to our homeland, but I was hoping to hear from both of you guys on maybe some less salient threats in terms of our threats to our political system and also our independent media.
Well, I mean, it was very much my argument that over time, the corrosive effects that a climate of fear that terrorists seek to create, manipulate, and exploit can have on liberal societies. And I think certainly from the terrorist point of view, from ISIS and Al-Qaeda, I mean, they see this as one of our Achilles' heels. I mean, terrorists themselves always seek to achieve their ends through psychological manipulation. This is why we always say that terrorism is much, psychological warfare, or for its psychological repercussions as its actual effect on the specific target. And unfortunately, in a media-saturated world with multiple outlets, with the terrorists being able to control their own media, they have that ability to, I think, to a greater extent than before, to thrust their causes or to put their arguments and their false facts into the world's dialogue or into the discussions, and also to have that pernicious effect on the societies that they're seeking to undermine.
Thank you for that question. Yes, sir. We'll wait for a microphone. Thank you. Oh, right here.
Sami Ayoub, beauty faculty here. So I have a question for Peter. What's your assessment with the CVE programs that is currently being tried in different places in the US? Thank you.
So CVE is countering violent extremism. I think there's been a sort of conflation between there is an important distinction to be made between two things: counter-radicalization and counter-recruitment. Now, I think countering radicalization is a fool's errand because being a radical is not a crime. Obviously, it's a precursor to doing something. But what we need to focus on is counter-recruitment. At the end of the day, that's what we care about. We care about people recruiting or self-recruiting to ISIS. And stopping that is much more important than trying to stem the tide of bad thoughts around the world, which we're never going to be able to achieve. I think the government is doing a much better job, the State Department in particular, reconceiving the way that it does CVE, countering violent extremism, not sort of saying, hey, the United States is great, ISIS is bad, but standing up sometimes covertly, local voices and local languages with counter-ISIS messages, and they may not be necessarily very pro-American, but they're liberals, they're seculars, they're comedians, or whatever the message is. And bringing that to the fore, I think that's the government has got smarter over time. We've had 15 years now. The other large point about CVE is you can't measure things that don't happen. So a successful campaign that counters violent extremism, it's unmeasurable because the whole point about it is that people don't do things. By its nature, it's always going to be kind of an amorphous thing. It's going to be hard to say what are the metrics for success. But I think we are doing a better message, and I think a better job. And I think also the social media companies. Social media companies are, by definition, usually anti-Washington. They're usually immature. But they have understood this is a real problem. By the way, what's really getting their attention is they're being sued by the victims of terrorism, by making the argument in Orlando and other places that but for social media, this attack might not have happened. So I think they're becoming much better corporate citizens. They're growing up, and Twitter and Facebook, I think, have done a good job. But they're also facing some real legal liabilities, and these cases have not yet been come to trial. But I don't think it's inconceivable that a social media company will there'll be a large civil suit that will really change this discussion. And these social media companies now have internal policy shops that really are kind of designed to kind of deal with this and take down anything that's against their terms of use, which is inciting violence.
Oh, thank you. Bruce, anything to add?
Well, I would just say that the motives of why someone, throughout history, of why someone becomes a terrorist are completely idiosyncratic and very individualistic. So there can't be a one-size-fits-all. And I agree with Peter, the counter-radicalization is almost a fool's errand. In some cases, people are motivated by very base emotions. I mean, embracing the catharsis of violence, have a sense that violence is empowerment that may have nothing to do with religion. I mean, this is what we find with some of the ISIS recruits, is that they're not terribly religious, for example. I mean, religion becomes the glue of the identity or that holds them together, but the motivation and the way they're drawn into the movement comes from sometimes very secular and very personal motivations as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time. I just want to let you know that every time I read their testimonies, read their books, listen to them on television, I learned so much from these two gentlemen. So please join me in thanking both of them and for their insights.
Thanks so much.